Welcome to Desert Wanderers, produced by Salt and Light Radio. If you're new here, we bridge the gap between you and the person in the pew next to you. I will be interviewing priests, religious, and laity in our local Boise diocese, asking questions that'll help you navigate your vocation and help build community wherever you are with whatever resources you may have. Let's build the city of God together. Hello, David. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
I'm fantastic.
Good.
I'm so excited to have you on today. So one of my passions in my home life is the temperaments. I think my husband might think that I'm a little crazy because I talk about them all the time. So I'm excited to have someone that has a little more knowledge than just the few books that I've read to come on and talk about temperaments today.
Yeah.
But first, I think a great place to start would be, let's go ahead and just talk about your background and your vocation and kind of how you got to this point that you are in today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So currently I work as a clinical mental health counselor at Catholic Charities of Idaho. I've been at Catholic Charities for a little more than a year now. I received my master's from Franciscan. But yeah, to go back, I didn't always want to be a counselor necessarily. I was actually in seminary at the Dominicans. And I really, from there, one fruit of that was really discovering how much I love ministering to people and just being just even if it could be a comforting presence to them in kind of a more spontaneous way. After I discerned out, I actually thought I really wanted to be a teacher, but I very providentially got a job at a high school, and it made me realize, it was a temporary job. It made me realize I don't really have the temperament to be a teacher, right? I do love instructing, but being a teacher is a little bit different. Just realized it wasn't my calling. I ended up getting a social services job, something called job developing, basically helping people find employment. Most of that job is kind of what we call cold calling, where we go around seeing if businesses are hiring, but a very small part, but important part of that job is mentoring people for interview skills, job skills, even life skills sometimes. And I found that was my favorite part of the job. And I got really good feedback from my colleagues regarding that. And so I started thinking maybe I want to do this specifically, where I just sit down and talk to people essentially. And I also kind of did a lot of praying. I even came across a book at one point that talked about how to find a job that you're passionate about. And it basically says, don't start with what you're passionate about. Start with what you're good at and what skills you developed, and then passion will follow as you continue to be successful and hone those skills. So I looked at my experience mentoring people in various capacities and seeing how I really found that being fruitful. And again, over time of prayer and discernment, I realized that counseling just made sense for pursuing a career.
So I wanted to take a second to go back really quick. When you said you went to Franciscan, was that Franciscan University in Steubenville?
Yes, that one. Yes.
Great school.
Yeah.
We're a fan.
Yeah. It was a great program, great formation. Yeah.
So we kind of spoke offline that you said that you were a convert as an adult. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And so did you go to Franciscan before you converted or?
No. So I converted in 2011. I was at the University of Oregon for my undergrad. That's when I was baptized and confirmed and received First Communion. I went to Franciscan in 2020. So it was that was after seminary.
Yeah.
That was quite a ways later. So yeah.
And then you also said that you were a Dominican for a while. Yeah,
it was 2 years. That was 2014 to 2016. Western Province in the Bay Area.
In the Bay Area.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay. And so what was your experience like starting, I guess, in those 2 years of being a Dominican?
Yeah, it was very formative, very good. It was very beautiful being able to enter into a deep prayer life. Kind of, even though the Dominicans are very active, the first part, especially novitiate, there's a lot more prayer because you're kind of forming your own walk with God, this spiritual life, the rhythm of prayer, right? We did a lot of fun things, you could say, too. We ministered, we traveled a little bit. But what was very formative was, I guess, two things. It was the silent prayer time and it was living in community, right?
Yeah.
And I would say that those were the most impactful, especially the second one, right?
Yeah.
Learning how to live with other men, and you kind of, you spend the whole day with them. Right. And it was challenging at times, also really good. 4 of my classmates are priests now. I still keep in touch with them from time to time. And yeah, so it was a very, very beautiful experience. I think every order has diverse people, learning how to appreciate how they live out their vocation, their own personalities. So that was a very good experience. And and just learning how to love different aspects of prayer, like the divine office, for example. We prayed that 4 times a day, more or less. And that was a beautiful thing to dive into, where you're just reciting the Psalms several times a day, and they start to echo in your mind. And obviously, we always struggle with our humanity, but you kind of enter more into the mind of God by just reciting his words he's revealed to us back to him.
I just started listening. I feel like every time I say I just started listening to it, I'm like, I very much just started this like a couple of days ago. No, but last week I started listening to, what is it called? Sing the Hours, I think, or
okay.
It's on Spotify. Father Tim, actually, when he was on, he recommended it as a podcast. And they do morning prayer and evening prayer, and it's released every day, and it's sung, and they have I don't know if it's the same guy editing the background humming, but they have him sing it, and then they have people that join in and chant for some of the chanting parts, and it's just really beautiful. And I have to admit, I've quite enjoyed praying morning prayer and evening prayer consistently. And I think you're right. There's something about the words. I'll notice specifically when it's sung, because you can chant it or just read it, but when it was sung, I'll listen to myself humming the tune in which they've hummed chanted the hours, which I think is really special. So that's something that I think I agree with you. The hours is something really special.
Yeah.
I don't know if many other people have experienced, I don't know how often people experience them being chanted, because I think the first time I experienced it was with brothers at Verbum Spei. So it was the first time you had ever heard of the hours?
No, it wasn't the first time I'd heard about them, but kind of doing in that capacity. I went at the University of Oregon. The Newman Center is run by the Dominican Order. And so they would do that, I think, before their evening daily mass. And so I was familiar with it, but it's a little different when you're in a church or a priory and there's choirs on both sides, and you take turns chanting it with set tones. And so that was obviously a little bit different. I might have been to Mount Angel in Oregon, and I think before I entered religious life, I'd seen the Benedictine monks doing it. So it wasn't a completely new thing for me, but of course doing it, participating in that capacity was of course a different experience.
I didn't think I ever experienced. I went to Belmont Abbey College in North Carolina. And they were Benedictines, and I think there was maybe 2 times that before or after mass they were doing some chanting from one side to the other side of the room. And I don't think I ever put it together that was the hours. I think I was I was, I guess, in a different world at that time, you know? But I wish I would have, because that would have been really cool to experience the back and forth of it. I could see how that would be really impactful.
It's challenging too, because you get up early and you chant them, and you're not always completely cognizant and there, but just having that rhythm. And that's the beautiful thing. Of course, you focus as much as you can, but it's okay. You're kind of part of this body and this community, and it's just kind of being present there. Sometimes if that's all we can bring, that's okay. Of course, we do our best to be fully present, but it was sometimes a challenge to be fully engaged all the time, as it always is in our faith and prayer.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of go back on really quick is, before you were baptized, what were some of the influences that brought you into the church? And then from that, when did you decide to go into the Dominicans?
I'll definitely condense. My conversion story is a long story, so I'll condense it. So just what I was raised in was the New Age movement. And so it was kind of it's broadly speaking, it's sort of a syncretistic spirituality that combines Eastern religion practices like aspects of Hinduism, Buddhism. And
Oh.
I was raised in that. And in terms of influences, it was started with kind of just exploring and asking questions. One big turning point was going to a Catholic mass and encountering God there in a very confounding way. And so then I just started doing a lot of apologetics research and seeing what the church had to say about why Jesus was God, and looking into history and continuing to pray and experience things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, just that was a combination of people in my life answering questions, supporting me, reading various books. I think Peter Kreeft was the first Catholic apologist I really got into. Just reading the Church Fathers. So things like that. Yeah, it was a several year-long process. I think I first started looking into the Catholic faith about 2 or 3 years before I actually converted. So I took my time in some ways. I would say, it was interesting. I first started to think about the priesthood even before I officially converted, because it's, you're entering into that world and you start to think about what is that going to look like when I become Catholic. And then people, I think there's this thing, well-intentioned, a lot of people see a young man is practicing as his faith or getting into it, and have you thought about the priesthood, right?
Yeah.
So that was in my mind. And the year after I graduated from college, so I was baptized I think it was my junior year of college. And then after I graduated, I spent a year of campus ministry at the Oregon State Newman Center. And I spent that year discerning and figuring out what I wanted to do. And during that year, I felt a pull towards pursuing the priesthood. And so I spent a year after that working and just preparing to enter, and then I entered the year after that. So I think the church wants you to be Catholic for 3 years before you enter seminary. And I think that was the exact timetable from when I was baptized to when I entered seminary, more or less.
So when you say you went into seminary, is that the Dominicans?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, yeah, technically the first year is the novitiate, so you're
right.
not technically in seminary at that point.
Okay.
But yeah, I did novitiate, and I took 1 year of simple vows, and I did seminary studies for that 1 year after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we kind of talked about, I'm going to now fast forward a little bit. Now we can go back to the point where you are now, which you're in counseling. Is that correct?
Yep.
Mental health counseling.
Yep. Yeah.
So did you go back to, when you went back to school to Franciscan, was that for counseling?
Yes. It was for a master's in clinical mental health counseling. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was great. The program itself, without being Catholic, is just a fantastic program. My mentors and professors were wonderful. They do a great job of giving you not just head knowledge, but experiential knowledge, you could say, which is essential for being a good counselor. So there was that. I had a great cohort. We still keep in touch, just a great group of friends. And then the Catholic community there was fantastic. Most of my friends were other grad students, mostly in theology. And it was just so beautiful to see all these people come from all over the world, bringing their own gifts, their own way of living their faith. And yeah, it was a great experience. And again, many people I still keep in touch with. And so yeah, it was a great experience to go there for my master's. Yeah.
Is that where you first were introduced to the 4 temperaments then?
I'm trying to think where I first was. I don't know if it wasn't, I will say it wasn't in my formal studies I was introduced. I don't remember at what point, but I was just sort of it's kind of one of those things in the Catholic world. And I think I stumbled upon it. Yeah, I can't quite remember when I first, actually, it was in seminary. I just remembered. It was in seminary that I think we were given the book or the Temperament God Gave You. And we did a temperament test. And I don't know if that was the very first time I was introduced, but that was one of the more distinct times I was introduced to it.
That's part of the reason I ask is because I feel like the temperaments are so helpful when being introduced to a large amount of people. Like having a general understanding between all the 4 temperaments will help you, and then having an understanding of yourself, your temperament, it helps you to relate to someone in a deeper way, because instead of getting annoyed or frustrated, you can kind of see that as an opportunity to see difference and growth, which I think is really beautiful. So that's, I guess, why I asked you. Do you feel like you use the temperaments at all in your clinical, like as a clinician?
Yeah, not in a formal diagnostic way, because they're not diagnoses or anything like that. But I certainly do. I keep them in mind, and they first came up explicitly when I found myself working with somebody. It was an individual, but we were talking about their marriage, and they would describe the dynamics between them and their spouse. And they would say something like, oh, yeah, my spouse just wants to move on very quickly and have like rapid fire answers. And my client would say, oh, I need time to think about things. And I'm like, wow, that sounds like a temperament difference to me. And so I kind of dove deeper, and I would use those moments to kind of give some education on maybe this is a difference in temperament. It doesn't mean that you're both meant to stay where you are, but it provides, like you said, understanding of why you're reacting differently, right?
Yeah.
But I also keep it in mind as I get to know a client, I kind of get a sense of what their temperament probably is. And they might even kind of be self-aware of it, or it becomes very obvious based on their thought process, how they process emotions. And I keep that in mind for maybe where we move on to, where we kind of focus on, because the idea with growing in your temperament is, like I said, you don't want to stay there. It's where you're starting from, and you want to certainly harness the strengths of that temperament, but how do we sort of counterbalance so we're not just stuck in the weaknesses either, right? So I definitely keep it in mind. It's not everything, but it's a factor I certainly consider as I work with people.
Yeah, I listened to The Temperament God Gave Your Kids. That was actually the first one I had kind of had an idea of temperaments. I also learned about it in college.
Yeah.
And then I think I listened to a couple podcasts. So I had pretty good grasp of like what my temperament was. I pretty much knew my like primary and secondary. But the one thing that struck me the most in that book was talking about natural virtues. So how she worded it was each temperament is inclined to natural virtues, and then they have natural weaknesses. And the goal, it would be to round out your child by like, once you notice what kind of natural, like to call into the natural virtues, but then also encourage them and like call them to grow in the places that they might be weaker. Yeah. And I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind when we're thinking of temperaments. I love the idea of thinking about it in virtue, because I think everyone knows about virtue, but unless you're reading some of the classic literature, it's not like we really talk about virtues much anymore, or at least in my experience. Yeah. So, okay, for anyone that doesn't know, let's go ahead and take some time on this, but could you explain the temperaments? What are the 4 temperaments, if you have any history on them? Yeah. All of that.
Sure, yeah. So they're actually first theorized by Hippocrates. He was a doctor from ancient Greece. My sense is he was just observing how people react to things. And that's how we could think of what temperaments are, how we emotionally and cognitively react to moments, whether it's slow, quickly, how long they are sustained. Now, he had a pseudoscientific theory. It came from an excess of certain bodily fluids, right? Which we now know that's not the case. But my assumption, he was like doing his best to give a biological explanation, right? But that's kind of where the names come from. So the 4 temperaments are sanguine, phlegmatic, melancholic, and choleric, right? Sanguine, it's like blood, right? So it's excess of blood. Phlegmatic's like excess of phlegm. And then melancholic and choleric, it's 2 different bile colors, I believe, were the explanation. But again, we retained those names, but it doesn't mean that's where they come from. It still has to do with our biology, how we operate in some sense. But just that explanation isn't quite correct, right? But yeah, they've kind of stood the test of time, obviously, and many psychologists and theologians, spiritual writers, have kind of considered them as the basis for explaining why people behave the way they do, right? And what I do like about the temperaments, as opposed to other personality types, is there's only 4, so it doesn't pigeonhole you in one very specific kind of code or personality type, but also they're flexible in the sense that we start with a certain primary, secondary, maybe even tertiary, but we're not stuck there, right? Where as we grow in holiness, we we can sort of harness the strengths, like I said, but also not be bound by the weaknesses. There's different theories too about whether you always retain the imprint of your original temperament or you completely lose it. My opinion is that you still retain a kind of the flavoring of your original one, but you're also not bound by it. And that's just my opinion. Some people say that you kind of almost lose completely your original temperament as you grow in holiness. So those are just some differing opinions about it.
Well, I like that. I think that's an interesting point. You're saying growing in holiness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that I would agree with you in that you probably still would immediately react in a certain way. But you might be able to stop yourself and then choose to act a different way.
Yeah. It's interesting how virtue does develop, because the idea is that virtue is a habit. So after a while, it might become easier and easier to actually do the thing that you would originally not be so inclined to do, right? And I think we've maybe seen that in our own lives where maybe a few years ago, it would have been very difficult to do something, right? And after a while, like, it's getting easier and easier. And now it's almost second nature, right? Yeah. But I do get a sense that it's kind of, I think of an analogy of the male and female genius idea, right? That both men and women have particular gifts they offer, right? For example, within the context of marriage. But the idea behind being married is that you learn to take on the qualities of the male and female, right? The other, right? So that you can also have that, but you still retain that natural strength of being male or being female. And so I think in a similar way, you still have that natural strength as a sanguine or a melancholic, but you're able to, as a melancholic, do sanguine things, for example. Yeah. And it may even become easy after a while, right?
Okay, so one of the things I want to touch on before we continue back into the temperaments is you mentioned personality types, and there is like every kind of personality quiz that you would like to take. Yeah. As a clinician, do you think those are helpful for people to participate in? I really like personality types, and I think they're interesting. Yeah. But it's interesting. More of my friends are. And I'm sure we'll get into this. I'm a sanguine. And a lot of my friends are melancholics, actually. Yeah. And they all think they're dumb, the personality quizzes. And I am like, I love them. Yeah. So I guess in that light, are they helpful? And at what point do you think they can get taken too far? And at what point do you think someone should try to understand their personality more? And this could be a short runoff before we go back to what the actual temperaments are.
Right. I think a huge danger of them is, like I mentioned, people can pigeonhole themselves and use a personality as an excuse for basically bad behavior, right? Just saying, it's just the way I am, right? And I think that's a big danger. And we're not even doing consciously, right? And I think there can be in danger of overly identifying with that, right? Yeah. Almost seeing yourself and others through the lens of temperament purely, right? That can be a real danger, right? Right? Because we're much more than just our temperaments, right? Yeah. And I guess I'll say there's debate about how valid certain ones are. Even some might be spiritually problematic, for example. So I think there's some
personality quizzes.
Yes. Okay. Like I guess it might be good to call like the Enneagram. There's questionable spiritual origins behind that.
Really?
Yeah. So I'm not the biggest expert in it, but I've seen there's potential issues with where it comes from and kind of where it can go as well. And coming from the New Age movement, I'm particularly wary of things that have a esoteric sort of quality to them. Myers-Briggs, that's one that's all right. I could see how that could be valid in certain ways. The issues I have with that one is it is so specific. It can again pigeonhole somebody. So that's why I'm more inclined to the 4 temperaments. Again, stood the test of time, and there's a flexibility in them. That's why I'm kind of more inclined towards them.
What do you think of? There's a couple other ones, like the Working Genius. Have you heard of that one?
I don't know if I have. Maybe if you describe it. Yeah.
It says that there's this is more targeted towards work. So I actually worked in a couple of. This is a really funny story. Actually, I'll tell you this one. Yeah. So the Working Genius is actually something that we've done here at the office, and I think it is very helpful. Okay. And I don't think it necessarily pigeonholes you, but basically you have things that you do naturally that you enjoy.
Yeah.
So like things you like and you enjoy.
Yeah.
Then there's things that you do well that they don't give you a lot of life, but you can do them and they won't burn you out. And then there's the things that you really dislike or that you still might be good at. Right. You might not be good at them. You might be good at them, but you don't like them and they drain you.
Right.
And so for our office, we've decided that it's good to know everyone's strengths and weaknesses and what they enjoy and what they don't enjoy so that we can avoid burnout, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that one I think is like fairly good. And it doesn't necessarily say anything truly about your personality. It's more like what types of work you enjoy.
Right.
But I have before, speaking of like new agey religions, I did my first job out of college was at a recruiting firm, and our boss, when you got there, you got a Buddha baby, and it was like this little Buddha doll.
Okay.
And he'd have you put it on your desk, and then he would say, everyone, I have a call with some like executive or whatever, and I need like this, or right now they're having their meeting. And instead of praying as Catholics, like, oh yeah, like this meeting's happening right now, we should pray that it goes well. It was like, everyone grab your Buddha and rub their belly. So I felt so awkward as a Catholic that I ended up bringing a Mary, like it was Mary on the donkey and Joseph's leading her, and it's this really beautiful wood figurine, and she has a pregnant belly. Okay. And I would be like, I put it right next to Buddha, and whenever they said that, I would rub Mary's belly. So like, I'm just going to ask Mary.
Yeah.
But anyways, we did different temperaments. I forget which one it was. There was the Strength Finder was one of them.
Yeah, I know that one.
And then the other one, remind me, is this the Enneagram? It has the 4, there's like 4 letters.
That's Myers-Briggs. I believe.
Like, there's like 4. They're not, it's not the Myers-Briggs where you have like the ENFJ or whatever, right? Not like that. It was like there was 4 categories and you got 2 of them.
I'm not sure. Maybe. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think Enneagram has like 9, because 9 like different.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's interesting though. Would you characterize personality type things differently than like maybe work type ones? Like would the Strength Finder and like the Working Genius be different than a personality type?
I would say it is, partly because it's in a specific domain, right? It's kind of like because personality kind of covers everything about you in certain, it's not your whole person, right? But I guess every domain of your life potentially. Whereas with work, that's obviously one domain, right? And it also makes a lot of sense that you would want to hone your strengths and don't worry about the weakness part, right? Maybe there are times to be stretched, right? Yeah. But it makes sense that in a group of employees, you want people to do what they're good at naturally, right? Yeah. Not just, I'm just going to challenge you just to do. No, we want to work well as a team. And it makes a lot of sense that we would, okay, you're good at this, you're good at this. We'll have you do this thing you're good at. We'll have you do this thing you're good at, right? So that makes a lot of sense that you would want to find that and how it's a little different than personality, right? Because when we're growing in virtue, we want to be stretched, right? And out of our comfort zone, which is also true in work sometimes, but a little bit different way to go about that, Yeah. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Amazing. Thank you for going on that tangent with me.
Yeah, sure.
Because it is true that I think most people would consider the temperament quiz or the temperaments as a type of personality test that you can give yourself, right? So, okay. So with that being said, let's go into the 4 temperaments. Do you think you could give me a brief overview or long, whatever you want, of each temperament as you know them? Sure,
absolutely. So like I mentioned, there's 4 of them, and it's kind of set up on a wheel. So you have primary, secondary, and in fact, we all experience aspects of all of them at some point, right? So it's not completely exclusive. So it's a spectrum, you could say, right? So the first one I'll mention is sanguine, right? I mentioned a good way to think about them is how you react emotionally. So sanguines react quickly and strongly, but doesn't last long, right? So that's somebody, for example, who has a lot of enthusiasm, joy. That's kind of a characteristic of a sanguine, right? When some negative qualities could be something like being distracted easily, stuff like that, right?
Okay, sorry, really quick.
Yes.
On that.
Yes.
Do you think that when it comes to other diagnoses like ADHD and all those things, do you think those people tend to be sanguines? And I can say that because I'm a sanguine. Do I have ADHD? Maybe undiagnosed. Who knows? So in that kind of thing, do you see any correlations between like a temperament and maybe like a type of diagnosis ever?
I personally tend to actually. I can't say I've seen data that shows definitively there is a correlation, but anecdotally, I can certainly see how certain temperaments could be drawn to certain mental health challenges, right? So yeah, and I'll explain more. Like with melancholic, I think they can be prone to depression more easily than others. But every temperament can suffer from different mental health diagnoses. Just because you're sanguine doesn't mean you'll never be sad or depressed, right? For example, but anecdotally I have seen that. I can't say for sure that's how it is though, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the sanguine, fast to react, usually doesn't last long.
Exactly.
I
Yes.
would totally agree with that.
Okay. Yeah.
I wake up in the morning, no matter what kind of fight or whatever. I wake up in the morning and it's a new day.
Yeah.
And it's gone
Yeah.
and forgotten.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which can be a great gift, but also a challenge if your person you had an argument with is not sanguine.
Exactly.
Right?
And then they're still mad and you're like, hi.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're like, what? That was yesterday. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, that's sanguine. Phlegmatic. So they react just very, very slowly, but not strongly, and just very, very even keeled. But you could obviously they don't even react, right? So they're very peaceful people, level-headed, but there can be a level of lack of ambition, which can be an issue potentially. So that could be a temptation for a phlegmatic person. Melancholics, they react slowly and strongly, and it's long lasting, right? So they can be very steady people, very deep thinking. The negative tendency could be to ruminate, right? Because it's like you just kind of get in that spiral of kind of deep thinking, right? It can maybe prone to sadness, right? And then a choleric, they react strongly and quickly and long lasting, right? So they can be I like to use the word fiery people, very ambitious, very driven, right? But they can be, their temptation is prone to anger, right? Because of the kind of, again, that fieriness that can kind of manifest in that way.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then can you go into maybe how the temperaments react with each other? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it depends, of course, right? Who's paired with who, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yes,
so
yes.
you said it's who paired with who. Do you think that, like, my experience, so like the pairing of, like, for example, my husband's a melancholic. So a sanguine with a melancholic, is there a similar, like, would you be able to, like, define the struggles that they both might have in a similar, like, sentence and combine them?
That's an interesting point. Yeah. I think it would certainly look different from both sides, right? Because especially if there's not this insight that the other person's different from me, it can feel different. So I'll give you an example, right? So a sanguine person, these are tendencies, right? So it doesn't mean every sanguine is like this, every melancholic's like this. So these are tendencies, right? But a sanguine can be a little more flexible, right? And sort of spur of the moment, spontaneous, which can be great, right? If new things come up, you're adaptable. All right, let's go with the flow. This is great. Let's jump into it. But that can, for example, lead to a negative tendency. It could be lack of structure, right?
Right.
And so a melancholic loves structure, right? Very organized, right? And so let's say, for example, they have a party they're going to, right? The sanguine could be a little more like, oh, we'll get there when we get there. It's okay. It's just a party. Melancholic, no, it starts at 8 and we're going to get there at 8. And for the melancholic, they can become very annoyed that why can't the sanguine just do things on time, right? Whereas maybe from the sanguine's perspective, it's like, calm down. It's just a get together with friends. We don't need to like get there exactly at one set time, right? And so the others, so they can like almost not understand each other. Like, what's the big deal, or what's going on, or whatever it is, depending on what they value based on their temperament, right? So that's why they might perceive it as the same event in a very different way. Right?
Yeah.
Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I one of the things you said earlier was that someone can see their relationships only through the view of temperaments.
Right. Yeah.
I feel like I fall into that maybe a little.
Okay. Yeah.
I I don't know, because I think the reason that I like personality tests and then the reason I like the 4 temperaments is because I want to understand people. I want to connect with people, and I want to be able to relate with them and connect deeply, right? Those are kind of things that I enjoy.
It's a wonderful sanguine quality, in fact. So
right.
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think in many ways, I think it's helped our marriage because of what you said earlier, because of the fact that I see them as other. I think that reading the book, The Temperament That God Gave You, was very helpful. I read the Melancholic one as well. So I read mine and then the Melancholic one that has a part where it talks about like marriage, what that might look like, or like parenting, what that might look like. And then I also read the one for your children, and I still read the Melancholic one and how to deal with it. And I feel like I understood my husband so much better.
Yeah.
And it was able to give us a lot of actually good conversations about how we react. But I also feel like I can almost be like, watch, I'm going to say this and I almost can predict what you're going to respond back. Yeah. What would you recommend for someone who may fall for the sanguines out here who might overindulge in the personalities and seeing life through those glasses?
Right. For sure. Yeah. Well, I think this is not just a sanguine problem. I think we can all jump to conclusions, right? And we can try, because I think we want to be able, our mind just wants to predict things, right? We want to prepare for what's coming next. And so I think we just can all naturally tend to, okay, I know, especially someone you're married to, right? When you do see patterns and your mind looks for patterns. And so you kind of jump to that conclusion, right? Oh, here's what they're going to say next, right? You know, it's a little bit, I don't know if this is cliche or not, but I think, you know, a key part is slowing down, actively listening, having an attitude of curiosity. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's kind of a key aspect. Maybe you're asking for sanguines in particular, right? There can be this enthusiasm, and a key part of that would be like, for example, slowing down, right? Melancholics now are super slow already, right? So it's like in terms of thinking and methodical, right? So it might be a little bit different, right? Kind of a maybe challenge to be proactive would be kind of the maybe something they could work on, for example. I actually am primarily melancholic, kind of melancholic, phlegmatic is my tendency for sure. So, yeah.
When I was introduced to them, I was told that there is like a primary and a secondary typically.
Right.
So do you think that there's common pairings, like more common pairings than others for the temperaments in one person? And then I'll say like, so primary, secondary. And then the follow-up question to that would be, and do you see that they commonly pair with other temperaments?
That's interesting. So the second part, is that more like people they tend to marry or friendships or?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. There are specific stats on these, but I don't quite remember what those are. The tendency is your primary and secondary are adjacent on the wheel, right? Okay. And so like a melancholic and choleric are adjacent, and so it's most common for someone to be, for example, primary melancholic, choleric secondary. You can't,
really?
yes, because it's the idea there's an overlap, right? And there's like a sort of that spectrum, right, that you fall into.
That is so interesting. Most of my friends are melancholic, phlegmatic.
Okay, yeah, so that can go the other way, right? Because melancholic and phlegmatic are also adjacent.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay, yeah. I see what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
Now, what's a little more rare is for opposites to be primary and secondary. It's not impossible. It can happen. But it's a little more rare for like someone to be primary sanguine, secondary melancholic, because they're opposites on the wheel, right? Okay. That's not impossible, but a little less common. I mean, I mentioned I'm primarily melancholic, phlegmatic. I also see some sanguine features that I have. Like I'm actually extroverted, which is not a melancholic or phlegmatic tendency. So that's very much possible. Right?
How would you describe being extroverted versus introverted?
Right. So extroverted introversion is not whether you like to be alone or with people necessarily. It's where do you get your energy.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So I'm actually recharged being around people, right? And I actually feel a little bit drained when I'm by myself for too long.
That's okay. That's interesting that like, as a melancholic,
exactly,
you would have that.
It's a little quirky for sure. Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. Whereas someone who's introverted, alone time is what recharges them. Maybe obviously they may still very much enjoy being around their friends, but it's like, all right, they have kind of a time limit in that sense.
Yeah.
And it's not like I don't enjoy alone time either, right? But it's like, where do you get recharged? Where do you get recharged from? So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was a good shift for me in college. I actually had someone being like, no, it's not that you just enjoy, it's that your energy. Like, do you feel drained after?
Right.
And I do think it's helpful in parenting as well. I have a little harder time applying like my relationship as a parent to my children with their temperaments.
Yeah.
Just because like they're still really little. And so it's not like we're having really deep conversations or I'm seeing them like use their temperament more. It's, they're playing, and it's most of the time it's me telling them not to fight with each other and whatever.
Yeah.
But I do notice my daughter is, I think she may be a melancholic phlegmatic.
Okay. Yeah.
She's very slow paced.
Okay. Yeah.
And the thing is though, as again, when we're talking, in light of the virtue of it has made me stop and think like, this is not like, I have to continually tell myself this is not a bad thing. Her like wanting to be slow and deliberate and looking at everything and taking the whole world in as it is a really beautiful thing.
Yes.
Because I think for me, a lot of things can just like go right on by, and I'm like very like, let's get to point A, you know. And if we get stopped, it's fine. But it's like most of the time, it's like, let's go. Yeah. And to have someone be very deliberate about looking at this rock and the corners of the rock and the texture of the rock, and I'm like, my like little rabbit feet are just like like thumping, like waiting to go.
Yeah. And you had asked about people like pairing with each other, right? And again, I don't know specific stats, but I did hear an interesting axiom that people tend to be drawn friendship-wise towards similar temperaments, but romantically to opposite. Not always, of course, right? Yeah. But that, because part of it, it's like you kind of, it's like someone with the same temperament. It's like you get each other, right?
Yeah.
But we can be drawn to kind of something that we see opposite the other person, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's not always the case, right? But so you're drawn to that thing that's different, but it's also going to be very challenging, as we've been talking about, right? Like a choleric might be really appreciate a phlegmatic's calmness, but they might, let's get to it. And a phlegmatic might be drawn to the ambition and kind of, again, that fiery sort of aspect of a choleric, but okay, let's chill out a little bit. Like we don't have to be running, all the time, right? So that's where the draw, but also the challenge can be, right? But again, you mentioned that book, Temperament God Gave You, talks about marriage. There's a book called The Temperament God Gave Your Spouse.
Yeah. And
they go through every temperament combination and say that every combo can work. It's not that it only works if you're opposite or the same or adjacent. It's a matter of, do both people want to grow in virtue?
Yeah.
And how do you kind of harness the strengths and counterbalance the weaknesses that you both bring to the table, and also help to complement each other in that, right? And so, yeah.
I think that it's a big gift that you can give to your kids if they have opposite. And I'm not saying it isn't if you're not opposite, but I am saying that I think there's a big gift if you can appreciate and respect and love your partner when they're opposite and when it's not like as easy to interact with like when your temperaments are kind of colliding. I think if you really are intentional about this, which we're not always, but when we are, I think it could be a really big witness to our kids of how to be well-rounded and to say, okay, yes, I can see how you're calling me out of this and you're calling me, or out of this weakness into this virtue. Right. And you're right. Like, I do need to be more organized or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
I do think that that's a big gift that we can give our kids. And I think that's something that I continually try to tell myself as well when it comes to the temperaments, and hopefully that we could have more rounded kids. I had a gal on, her name was Evelyn, and she was a Waldorf, early childhood Waldorf instructor. And she said that one of the things that they talked about when they think of temperaments, which is a little different than I think how we're viewing it, but she said that as an instructor, your goal would be to help each child get to a center. So that you have a little bit of all four, like a little bit of mastery over all four temperaments, that you're very well rounded. So you have a little bit of peace sometimes, you have a little bit of ambition sometimes. And I think that would be similar, that if you have opposite personality or temperaments, that you could probably give your kids that. Or if you don't do it well, you could not.
Right.
You know, it's something we have to try to do. Right.
Yeah. And I can actually completely agree with that. The idea that finding center in the sense that you want to have the strengths of all of them and none of the weaknesses. I mean, Christ, you could see him that way. He had the strengths of every temperament with none of the weaknesses. Right. And sometimes we're called to be ambitious, right? Sometimes we're called to have peacefulness. Sometimes we're called to have enthusiasm and joy. Sometimes we're called to think deeply or even more. Right. And so it's like we kind of embrace all those parts of ourselves, right? And that's how it can be helpful to kind of develop the strengths of each of the temperament for that reason.
What are some of the what do you think are some of the common frustrations each temperament has with the other? Like, does that make sense? Is that
I'd say so. Yeah. So maybe if we start with the choleric, right? A common frustration, like with a sanguine, right, might be maybe a fickleness potentially. Again, I don't want to characterize all sanguines, but if they can perceive that, right, like why isn't there like a constancy, right?
Yeah.
Like that could be example, or with a phlegmatic, that there's like a lack of inertia, right? Like they're kind of complacent, right? Whereas a choleric is very like ambitious, for example. And I think with a melancholic, because cholerics are very action oriented and melancholics are very, let's like let's think about it kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like a choleric might say, let's stop thinking, let's start doing, right?
Yeah.
So for example, and then sanguine, I think, for example, I guess overlap with phlegmatic and melancholic, there can be a desire for being positive, right? And so it might be difficult for a sanguine being around maybe a phlegmatic or melancholic. It's okay. Let's get a little more let's stop brooding almost, right? And a choleric, right? There can be a tendency to anger, right? So a sanguine might be a little bit off-put by maybe anger coming up, right?
Yeah.
Again, this is, like I've said before, right? These are not that every one of these temperaments has these qualities, but that's a potential struggle. Yeah, and phlegmatic, it's interesting because being very even-keeled, they can kind of go with the flow, so they can appear to be okay with everyone, right?
Yeah.
But I think what's important for people to realize about phlegmatics is they still feel things. It's not that they're just internally neutral. They still feel things, just may not be expressed.
Yeah.
Right? And so there may be a struggle with, especially the extroverted temperaments, choleric and phlegmatic, that the phlegmatic just wants peace, and the sanguine and choleric, they want to go and do things, right? And the phlegmatic needs time to kind of have that, right? Have that sort of stable kind of time, right?
Yeah.
And then melancholic, I think, again, kind of similar with the phlegmatic, there can be a need to slow down, reflect. Like, let's pause and think before we just start doing. So that can be a struggle potentially. Especially with sort of those more extroverted ones, right? Yeah.
So do you think as people are listening to this, do you think if they kind of see any of those frustrations, that maybe that's with either their kids or their spouse or their friends, that they might be able to, I guess, come out of themselves a little bit more and see like, oh, okay, now I can kind of see maybe my friends are in these temperaments and I can grow.
Yeah. And depending on your relationship with the person, there's kind of a two-step process, right? Especially thinking about marriage, right? It's good to, of course, express what's going on in your own internal world, how you're feeling, right? Without judging the other person. So that can be easy to almost judge the other person. Like I said, I didn't mean to throw the fickle label out in a negative way, but the melancholic or choleric might say the sanguine, like, why are you so fickle? Which is kind of an unfair judgment, maybe. That's not how they're thinking about it. Kind of expressing more, this is how I'm feeling, right? So first expressing that. Also thinking in a way, having through our conversation, thinking, how can we both meet in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example, like the example I gave with the melancholic and the sanguine going to the party, right? Maybe talking about, okay, the melancholic deciding maybe between them two, how can I be a little more flexible, right? Especially when we don't have to be right on time for something. And maybe the sanguine could be challenged. how can I have a little more of a stricter schedule, maybe, potentially, right? Kind of honor that desire of the melancholic to have structure, and how can the melancholic honor the desire of the sanguine to be flexible at times, go with the flow, and when maybe you're called to go with the flow, right? Yeah. So that's kind of meeting in the middle is kind of a good way, of course, when appropriate and when it's virtuous to do so, right?
Another point is I do kind of want to spend a little bit more time on the phlegmatic, because even in the book about the temperament God gave your children, they kind of hound this point over and over again, that the phlegmatic is often your like easiest child, and they often get overlooked.
Right. Right.
So I think let's just spend a little time with the phlegmatic and say maybe what is some advice for you to the phlegmatics. And then if anyone knows that they're in a relationship with a phlegmatic, or maybe how they can kind of determine if someone's phlegmatic and then not forget them or leave them out.
Right, for sure. It's funny. I feel like we were almost kind of speaking of that one the least as well. So it's kind of funny you bring that up. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, they're very easygoing. It's just like, oh yeah, but the negative side is they can just kind of fade in the background, right? Because of being so easygoing. I think for the phlegmatic is deciding on first, really identifying what's important to them, and deciding that they're willing to fight for those principles they have, right? Or developing those high ideals that they might have, right? Because there can be a lot of complacency. It's okay. What's something that important that I want to strive for, and then deciding what is that concretely going to look like. So making a really specific plan and sticking to it, right? And asking themselves, how can I challenge myself? How can in other words, for a phlegmatic, comfort is really important to them, which comfort's not bad in itself, but so a phlegmatic therefore can ask, how do I appropriately get out of my comfort zone, right? How do I be uncomfortable? And also reminding themselves it's okay to be uncomfortable. That's how we grow, right?
Yeah.
So I think that can be for a phlegmatic what they can do for themselves. And then for someone else is kind of with whenever you're approaching anybody of any temperament, right? Meet them where they're at, but then challenging them to step out of it, right? In other words, honoring what's good in them, but then while honoring it, how do we actually move forward, right? And sometimes actually a way to do this is to, in a way, help them see how going beyond what they're naturally comfortable with is actually a better way for them to speak to the desires of what they want. So a good example, right, with the phlegmatic is they desire comfort, right? And so you meet them in that place where they're at, right? Kind of a gentleness is not, being really harsh, right? With anyone or any child, but especially a phlegmatic child can be really defeating, right? So meeting them where they're at, kind of understanding maybe what they're processing in that moment, right? But then maybe help them along with taking the next step. And even saying, hey, why don't I help you out? Why don't we both do this, right? I can even help you, maybe if it's homework, right? Let's pull out your homework assignment, right? But then leading them, okay, challenging them to then start doing things, right? So, and then I mentioned kind of speaking that desire for comfort, in a way showing them, maybe with an older child, showing them actually a way to achieve true comfort and peace is by kind of tackling the things we're called to do, right? I think you can apply this to any temperament, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like what you're saying. I think it really does speak volumes in light of a marriage because, or even living in community.
Yeah.
I think it would go, in those two specifically, I think it would make a lot of sense because oftentimes priests live alone, so they might not have to deal with this as much. But specifically when you're living with someone, there's this part of like you have needs that need to be met, right?
Yeah.
Especially in marriage. And then I'm sure it looks different in a community, but it probably there's similar aspects there. And I like what you're saying about we have to, as a phlegmatic, you would need to tell people, you would have to get to the point to be able to tell them your needs
right.
or else you're going to be forgotten. But it's the same thing with everyone because I think, I don't know, maybe this is just me and not other sanguines, but I can also be kind of a people pleaser.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I want to be friendly and, right? Yeah. I guess that would be the rationale of the temperaments, but it still means like sometimes does that push me to, am I even saying my needs because I'm more like, oh, I just want to like be friends and have high energy that, I can like push that to the side or whatever.
Yeah.
And maybe with again, I'm not an expert on this, so you can correct me, but maybe like with a choleric, they might be really good at expressing their needs. So maybe it would be taking the time to be like, okay, I need to listen to someone else or give space for someone else to
right.
like say those things.
Yeah, that's definitely one part of it. It's also how you're expressing your own needs, right?
Okay.
Right. So I think it's like, so you mentioned choleric, right? So they can be very good at just saying what they want when they want it, right? Right. Potentially, right. Giving the other person space to say it, but also thinking, how can I gently express what I need, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that's the same.
Yeah.
So kind of that's the other side of the coin there. Yeah.
So if you could just put a generalization out there, how do like each temperament typically express their needs? Like,
yeah. Yeah, let me think about that. Yeah. So again, as I've been saying, these are typical things, right? You could say like maybe a tendency, right? Yeah. So I'm starting with choleric, definitely a directness, right? There's a sense of efficiency. So there can be a temptation, and maybe we'll start with the negative side, because ideally we want to like, or a negative temptation of how to express needs, right? So because we want to kind of, how do we correct that? And so for choleric, they might be tempted to, just say what they want when they want it, kind of efficiency, right? And so for them, it would be kind of slowing down and saying, okay, here's how I'm feeling, and making a request, right? That would be kind of a way to counterbalance that. A sanguine might be similar. You mentioned for yourself, there's this maybe a people-pleasing tendency, but a sanguine might also just be very quick to say how they're feeling, for example, right?
Yeah.
Very quickly. And so, again, there would be similar, because it's another extroverted temperament, slowing down, saying what's going on, what they're feeling, and making a request, right? Kind of patiently giving space for the other person to express what they would like, or to listen to that, right? Phlegmatic doesn't express their needs, right? So that's part of the issue, right? And so part of that would be just learning to do that, right? To kind of being more bold, kind of saying what's on their mind. Again, phlegmatics particularly can have a people-pleasing sort of temptation or inclination. And so realizing, my needs are important too, obviously honoring other people, but saying, okay, just being able to say what's on your mind. I think for a melancholic, there can be something similar to phlegmatic, right? Kind of sort of the kind of the stewing sort of temptation there, right? So I think similar to phlegmatic, deciding that you'll say what your needs are, right? And also kind of have maybe challenge to have a level of efficiency with it, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, when I've spoke with other melancholics, sometimes they say, well, the conversation just kept going. And so I just didn't say anything because it was, by the time I had the thought of what I wanted to express,
right.
The conversation wasn't there.
Right. Yeah. So kind of it's kind of erring on the side of action a little bit for the melancholic, right? There can be a perfectionist tendency for a melancholic, and so one reason that they can be, like they and myself being a melancholic, right, is letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, right?
Right.
And so deciding, like I'm going to do my best to kind of move forward, and so that can be one advice for melancholic people. Yeah.
Okay, so then, and I guess the kind of one of the last questions I'll have with maybe more of the negative side of the temperaments would be, have you seen any maybe tendencies that have, like, each temperament might have a tendency to a certain deadly sin that we have in the faith? Yeah,
and of course, every temperament can fall into every deadly sin, so we're not immune. But I think certain temperaments can be more inclined towards certain ones. And so I think we see this with spiritual writers. They talk about this too. So starting with sanguines, right? They can be very much drawn to enjoyable experience, sense pleasure. And so gluttony and lust are ones that they can maybe more easily fall into. With phlegmatics, again, there's that desire for comfort. So sloth can be a very common one for phlegmatics. For melancholics, despair would be something that they could very easily fall into, or more easily than the other temperaments. And then also, I would say, despair would be a major one, I'd say. And then for cholerics, big one would be wrath and pride, right? Because of that ambition, right? So those again, every temperament can fall into every one of those, right? Yeah. But those are ones that they can more easily fall into, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you were saying, I'm very, okay. So it's interesting because I always thought that I was, and this might go into what we were saying earlier. I always thought I was a sanguine choleric or choleric. And I think that I have those natural, but I also see that I have some phlegmatic tendencies. But I think if we're talking about like the sins, I definitely would have to relate with, I feel like in this point in my life, I have actually been struggling with feeling like the sin of sloth, like just like not praying and like not feeling that. But so I think it's really interesting. I'm like, maybe I am more phlegmatic than I think I was.
Yeah, potentially. But like I said, I think we all
can
struggle
fall
with all
into
of
those.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Anyways, okay. So then going into the positive sides.
Right.
So I just want to reiterate because we've kind of been focusing on a lot of the negative aspects, which I think is helpful because again, we're trying to call ourselves into virtue. Right. And to do that, we have to kind of know where we're starting. So again, let's talk about let's review the positives. But now that everyone has kind of heard this, I would like the viewer to kind of think, okay, now that I kind of understand a little bit more about maybe where I'm at, what kind of virtues I can pull from the other one, or like what virtues I might be called to culminate.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So sanguines, I'll start with that. So, like I said, we've talked about they have like a tendency towards joy, right? And that can be a really beautiful thing, right? They could desire a relationship with others. So being able to form communities, for example, keep communities kind of in a joyful place, or even relating to God, right? Having this sense of hope and optimism and kind of joy in God's presence can be a very beautiful thing. And sanguines can even bring the joy of others, like lift other people up in a really beautiful sense. And so I think it's a great quality of sanguines, right? Phlegmatics, they can be great peacemakers, right? They can kind of see all sides of an issue, right? And that can be a very wonderful quality to have, right? Bring stability and sense of dependability and loyalty in a friendship, and a sense of just a deep peacefulness, even in their prayer life. That can be a very good, beautiful thing. Melancholics they kind of, like I said, deep thinking. And so they can have a great depth even in their spiritual life, right? They can see things that maybe other people don't. Point out details, for example. There can be a sense of wanting very deep relationships, right? So a desire to dive deeply into friendship would be something a melancholic can bring to a relationship. And then cholerics are very driven people, right? So if a project needs to get done, a choleric is a great person, kind of lead the way and lead the charge, right? Cholerics can even inspire people, right? They can help a phlegmatic or a melancholic or anyone like see their own greatness, right? Like the choleric can say, I see this in you and I want you to excel and and they desire excellence for that person, right? So kind of harnessing those great leadership qualities to achieve great things. And we see saints from every temperament, really. So I want people to remember that. It's not like one that's better than the other. Like, oh, there's only saints in this one or that one.
Yeah.
Right? So I'll just give an example from each maybe. So there's some debate, of course, of the older ones because we can't know for sure. Teresa of Avila was sanguine, which is interesting because she was very deep in her spiritual life, right? But she was a great people person. She had a great sensitive joy and felt sense of God's presence, right? Phlegmatic, Thomas Aquinas was a phlegmatic, right? Able to see all sides of an issue. Yeah, because it's a summa of all theology, right?
Yeah.
So he's able to have this very balanced view and understand all sides, right? So he was phlegmatic, we can say. Melancholic, St. Therese of Lisieux, right? Very deep thinker, deep intellect, right? Great tender love of God, right? And then we see a choleric, St. Ignatius of Loyola, right? Very, very driven man. He, before his conversion, he was a soldier. That's where the choleric came out. But afterwards, he started the Jesuit order. He fought relentlessly against, the heresies of his day and kind of fighting for the truth, right? So we see saints, and there's many others, right? And we see with all these saints that they not only harness their strengths of their temperament, but even counterbalance the weaknesses of their temperament, right? So we see this great sanctity and holiness in their life, which I think provides inspiration for those who maybe fall into those temperaments, seeing that there's hope of, through God's grace, growing in virtue, even in spite of our fallen human state that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
It reminds me of what when I was in college. Sarah Swafford came and spoke, and she had this catchphrase about "be always striving," and I think that is kind of. I mean, if we're really thinking about the temperaments in light of virtue, I think really what all the saints did is they probably, although they had their primary way of reacting, they were able to get to that center point and be more balanced and more like Christ, right? Because like we said, Christ is kind of in the middle of all those. We see him in the middle of all those. So
yes, yeah. And I'd say balance, maybe not in a sort of, I assume this is how you meant it, like a mediocre sense, but how they excelled even in those opposite tendencies.
Yes.
So
that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a really great example of that is Saint Therese, right? The melancholic in her initially was very scrupulous and would ruminate and despair, right? But she was able to, in a way, turn that around and actually have great trust in God and surrender, right? Yeah. So she was a master of surrender in a way, right? So which can be a great sanguine tendency, right?
Yeah.
And so we see that in her, and we see that with, like, again, I mentioned St. Teresa of Avila, where you could say, quote, unquote, in spite of her sanguine temperament, right? She was able to dive very deeply, right?
Yeah.
Right? And that she wasn't bound by whatever way maybe her sanguine temperament made that slightly more difficult for her, right? She was a deep spiritual thinker. St. Ignatius, he had in his meditations, there's this great sense of compassion towards yourself and towards others that was meant to be cultivated. And Thomas Aquinas, obviously very driven, right, to stand up for the truth, right? Yeah. And so we see them exemplifying virtue in a very positive way, in a very effective way too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you see the personality or the temperaments express themselves in prayer?
It's a great question. Yeah. So again, we'll kind of look at maybe what's a tendency, right? And the good and negative qualities of that. So I think with a sanguine, right, potentially there can be a lot of, in a very positive way, like emotional type of prayer, right? Which is such a beautiful thing to have. Like, we're meant to have a loving relationship with God, and it's so beautiful when somebody can truly experience that, right? I think a challenge could be kind of staying at a relatively superficial level. So maybe for a sanguine to kind of slow down, deeply meditate on the Gospels, not just brush through them, but okay, how can I dive even deeper into something I already know quite well, maybe a gospel passage. So that's how it can look like in prayer for a sanguine. A phlegmatic, they can be very good at constancy in prayer, right? But there can be a complacency, right? Yeah. I have my routine in prayer, this is what I do. And so maybe for a phlegmatic, it can be going out of your comfort zone. I mean, a good example of that is a phlegmatic can be very people-pleasing with God and not say what's actually on their mind. So kind of being bold in their prayer, right? And saying, God, here's what I'm feeling, and actually I'm upset about this. And so maybe being a little more free-formed and open with God, right? A melancholic can be very good at diving deep into things, right? But the part of the issue there potentially can be to, again, stew and ruminate a little bit. And so part of their prayer life can be to surrender more, to have self-compassion, to let go of perfectionism, right? To surrender just where they're at in their life and being okay with that. A choleric can be very driven. I know cholerics can be drawn to things like Exodus 90. It's like, let's like accomplish things and do things. They can be very, maybe, ambitious in their routines of prayer, and also very action focused, maybe in the prayer themselves. Okay, God, what are you calling me to do, right? And so that sometimes we're not always called to that. Sometimes we're called to just sort of be present to God. So maybe letting go of practice, letting go of the doing focus of prayer, and just learning to be with God.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of let go of what's in my power, but just say, I'm just going to rest in God and humbly be present to Him and depend on Him. Kind of exercise that aspect. So those, it's kind of obviously general, right, and just one aspect, but those are some ways that the temperaments can kind of show themselves in prayer, both positive qualities and challenges potentially.
Amazing. Yeah. Amazing. Okay. I think so. What what would be the next step for someone? Say someone's listening to this right now.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, I kind of have an idea. Don't really know. What should I do? And then maybe they say, oh, you know what? Maybe the relationship I have with a friend or my spouse or my children, I can see that the problems I thought we were having are actually more temperament based.
Yeah.
What do they do? And well, I'll give you those two first and then we'll continue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we mentioned some books, like one of them was Temperament God Gave You. That could be good for a deeper understanding of maybe what your temperament is and the other temperament. And I would say if you kind of have a sense of what yours is, there's two steps. First is appreciating the qualities you do have. I think that's always an important step of growth, to harness what's good in you, right? And to love the person that God made you to be.
Yeah.
That's an essential first step, right? And then secondly, what is the next step of virtue I can take, both to harness my strengths, to counteract my weaknesses? And that kind of goes with appreciating where you start with, right? Because you can't become a super saint tomorrow, right? It's what's the next step in virtue I can take.
Yeah.
So having that patience with yourself, relying on God's grace, not going faster than the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And taking that next step that God's calling you to take. So I think that's kind of those are the next steps for yourself, I would say, for people, right? And I think in relation to others, of course, depends on the dynamic you have and the health of the relationship, right? But like you were saying with your husband, having an open conversation about, here's how I experience the world. How do you experience the world, right? And then how can we meet each other in the middle, maybe in some particular ways?
Yeah. Right? There's just been so many times that I just have to, this is more for like reminding myself, but like for everyone else, I think my husband and I have conversations like that, like once a month at least.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, for me, like I have to think, okay, he doesn't experience, like he is experiencing this in a completely like different way. And it's funny because when you ask, you think that you might know what's going on. And then you're like, wow, did not see that perspective. Right. Because we are different.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, even if you know your spouse's temperament, not even assuming based on what you so-called know about their temperament, like truly being curious, how do you experience this? 'Cause maybe they've grown, right? Or maybe it's, and they're their own person, right? It doesn't like all melancholics think this way. All cholerics think this way. Really, truly being curious of where they are and receptive to that, right? And based on that, okay, how can we both walk with each other, right? Towards growing in virtue, meet each other in the middle, that we both want to live, to grow in holiness in whatever endeavor we're doing. Maybe it's raising kids, maybe it's doing ministry or whatever, or just the day-to-day life, right? Whatever that looks like. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, where can people find you? How can they get in contact with you?
Right.
If someone wants to talk more about temperaments, or if they actually want to talk about something deeper about themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How can they find you?
Yeah. So I'm at Catholic Charities of Idaho. So our website is ccidaho.org. I'm one of several counselors there. We have great therapists that do faith-based counseling. Of course, I don't just look at everything through a temperament lens, but I definitely consider that. So we have ways of making an appointment, especially if we mentioned how temperaments can lead to not just vices, but some maybe very serious mental health challenges. And that's definitely the role that I would play. And so if people want to kind of address those things, they can, go to our website, ccidaho.org. And if it's a good fit, we can definitely, make an appointment if people want to address any mental health counseling needs they have.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you were here.
Yeah.
Do you want to close in a prayer with us?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we thank you for the ways that you have created us, that you have made us each unique, and you have called us each to grow in holiness in our own distinct ways. We ask that we would learn to love ourselves as you have created us, to appreciate the gifts of others, and that we would have the grace to grow in virtue in whatever way we're called to grow. We ask that your Holy Spirit would guide us and strengthen us as we continue to pursue a life of virtue. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Desert Wanderers. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up as well as subscribe down below. We're produced by Salt and Light Radio, so you can find us on social platforms at Salt and Light Radio or Desert Wanderers Podcast. We produce episodes every week and we launch them for you on Wednesdays. So make sure to tune in for next week's episode and we'll see you then.